During the 1990s, Asia was the hub of financial investment. In the years leading up to the 1997 Asian financial crisis, hot money in the form of high-interest short-term assets started to funnel into Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia, forming an economic bubble. The economy became severely leveraged, banks and firms lending more and more in US dollars. As the United States came out of its recession, increased interest rates strengthened the dollar. Capital started fleeing to the US, and the economic bubble burst, causing asset prices to plunge immediately. At the same time, a stronger dollar meant depreciated value of local currencies. The US-denominated debt of companies multiplied, causing more bankruptcies and further deepening the crisis. Let us take a look at what led to the downfall of the East Asian economy. The current accounts of South Korea, Thailand, and Malaysia in 1996 showed a huge deficit. What exactly does that mean? It means that these countries had limited foreign exchange reserves, which are foreign currencies, US dollars in this case, held by the Asian central banks to peg their local currencies against the US dollar at a fixed exchange rate. If, for example, demand for currency dropped, they would buy it back with US dollars to lower supply and increase demand for the local currency, hence stabilizing the exchange rate. All we have to know is, the smaller the reserve, the lower the ability of the government to stabilize its currency. Given the current account deficit, things weren't looking good for South Korea, Thailand, and Malaysia. And that was the perfect opportunity for speculators to strike. What are speculators and what do they do? Well, here's a little illustration. 1 ringgit exchanges for 1 US dollar. Jack is a speculator. He has 1 million US dollars. He borrows a loan and gets 99 million US dollars, totaling 100 million US dollars. Then, Jack purchases local government bonds and pledges them to further leverage a loan of 10 billion ringgit. This is called double leveraging. Leveraging increases the excess supply of ringgit in the market, thus decreasing demand for it. Jack now sells the 10 billion ringgits for 10 billion USD. The ringgit devalues. 1 ringgit now exchanges for 0.9 US dollars. As more and more speculators enter the local market, governments run out of their already limited reserves, unable to defend the ringgit. The exchange rate drops significantly to 1 ringgit for 0.1 USD as the ringgit floats freely. Jack now exchanges his 1 billion US dollars out of the 10 billion he had made earlier for 10 billion ringgit. He then repays his 10 billion ringgit loan. And voila, Jack just made 9 billion US dollars from his 1 million USD at the beginning. Meanwhile, in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, the economy crashes, and suddenly, loans which were borrowed in US dollars multiply, forcing firms and banks across Asia to default. Next up is a factor solely exclusive to Indonesia. Here, high-ranking government officials favored financial institutions that were run by their relatives or friends, called cronies, loaning them money without financial background checks. These cronies, knowing that the government would bail them out, would then invest in high-risky securities. This was called crony capitalism. Bank loans were also given out in a similar fashion. For example, Peregrine Investment Holdings in Hong Kong loaned a staggering $236 million to an unsecured Jakarta taxi company, in which, coincidentally, Indonesian President Suharto's daughter was a partner. Guess what happened? The company defaulted on its loan, and Peregrine went bankrupt. With so much indebted money in the hands of untrustworthy institutions, the economy of Indonesia was a ticking time bomb. Now that we know the major factors behind the downfall of the ASEAN countries, what exactly were the consequences of the Asian financial crisis? Like any financial crisis, the first thing to happen was this: the economic recession. In the most basic of terms, a recession is the stagnation of an economy, triggered by a reduction in spending. A slower economy constitutes the following factors. First of all, rising unemployment rate. During a recession, unemployment rates become unconventionally high, resulting in an immediate decrease in income, and thus real wealth, ultimately leading to a reduction in consumption and investment. Next, a falling GDP. The GDP of a country under recession typically shows a negative trend as well, as a result of slower economic activity and overall spending. Last but not least, a falling inflation rate. During recession, the inflation rate should generally show a negative trend, since economic activity is greatly reduced, and the price of economic consumption should be relatively low as well. But hold on a second, why does the inflation rate rise suddenly between 1997 and 1998, right as the recession hits East Asia? The answer is simple. The International Monetary Fund, IMF. Just as things had begun to hit an all-time low in Asia, the IMF stepped in with a $40 billion bailout program. However, the IMF had certain conditions it wanted fulfilled before the countries could get their hands on the bailout money. Firstly, reducing spending. The IMF wanted to ensure that its capital was being employed in the most effective manner, as well as to restore faith in the nation's fiscal solvency, showing that the government's current accounts were able to meet their long-term expenses. Second of all, advancing interest rates and allowing insolvent banks to fail. Crony financial institutions were forced to the doorstep of bankruptcy, unable to repay their inflated loans, ensuring a transparent and less selectively allocated financial system, independent of private interest and relationships. Both these contractionary measures led to the price hike of commodities across the ASEAN countries, explaining the absurd trend of the inflation rate from 1997 to 1998. Now, let's travel ahead a decade to 2007, the year the largest global financial crisis after the Great Recession in 1920s struck the world economy. How did history repeat itself? Well, before looking into the similarities, let's quickly flip through the causes and consequences of the global financial crisis. Here we go. The causes of GFC. First of all, loosened regulations. When you can earn money without any risks involved, you would do so. Therefore, originators have little incentive to uphold the credit standards on behalf of investors. But it ran out of borrowers qualified for prime mortgages eventually. This created the idea of subprime mortgages, which allowed borrowers with poorer credit history or lower repayment ability to borrow a mortgage and therefore high default risk. These subprime mortgages were again sold to investment banks, which securitized them into collateralized debt obligations and mortgage-backed securities, and then sold it to the investors. This resulted in moral hazard. High complexity of securitization. The credit agencies and credit default swaps issuers failed to evaluate the risk behind them. To match their clients' requests and to earn more profit, AAA ratings from credit agencies and CDS from insurance companies were given all the time. Investors relied on these ratings and insurance and invested heavily in CDOs and MBS. Thirdly, current account deficit. In 2006, the US posted 6% of its national income as the current account deficit, resulting in tremendous capital inflow. Large amounts of funds were available for loan, so interest rate was low. Underprivileged families were prone to go on subprime mortgages. Later, when federal fund was raised significantly to 5.25%, all of them walked away. Fourth, panic among investors. The default rate kept rising, so the investors started to panic. Housing prices kept going down, so more and more people defaulted. The depositors freaked out. Due to the mark-to-market principle, in which net value of an asset is updated according to its current market value. When housing prices decreased, the assets part of the balance sheet must drop significantly. Depositors worried that banks would go bankrupt and froze their deposits. A series of bank runs initiated then, from Bear Stearns to Lehman Brothers to all over the world. Now, what were the consequences of the GFC? Well, first of all, Great Recession. The recession is usually the consequence of a financial crisis, as we mentioned earlier.
GFC was no exception. With a sharp decline in securitization, assets and equity prices decreased drastically, and decreasing or even negative real GDP growth rate was witnessed. The world economy went dark. Second of all, bankruptcies or merging and acquisition of companies. Different from the case of AFC, the Fed cut interest rates substantially to ease monetary conditions. It made firms easier to borrow funds to finance their financial difficulties so that less banks went bankrupt. Secondly, the bailout from the US governments had been done to support these too big to fail firms such as AIG, Freddie Mac, or Fannie Mac. While some firms were merged or acquired by their competitors, for example, Bear Stearns was merged with JP Morgan at fire sale price.
Now that we know a little something about both crises, let us put them side by side and compare them. The AFC was an externally induced crisis where foreign hot money flowed in to build up asset bubbles that burst when their companies could no longer compete with the US. Local governments proved unable to sustain high interest rates to support their fixed exchange rates, as the money flowed out just as quickly. The GFC, the global financial crisis, was an internally induced crisis, where extended low interest rates led to the availability of easy credit. Too many people borrowed to buy property that they could not afford. Bankers securitized the loans and sold them to investors that did not understand the inherent risk hidden in these complex securities, raising property prices. US borrowers started defaulting on their mortgages. Property prices dropped, popping the property bubble, and investors all around the world lost their investment. Let us now look at specific points of comparison. First of all, the asset bubble. In both the AFC and the GFC, an extreme drop in asset prices or property prices could be witnessed. But here's the difference. The asset bubble in the AFC resulted from short-term, high-interest foreign money flowing into local economies that left just as quickly, which resulted in it bursting. In the GFC, the property prices were artificially inflated via accumulation of leverage in the economy, which collapsed as homeowners defaulted due to the lack of confidence in property performance. Next up, herd mentality. The similarity is as such. In the AFC, investors had a loss in confidence in the local currency when it depreciated slightly against the USD. In the GFC, depositors saw falling property rates and increasing defaults and had loss in confidence in banks. Both panicked in the face of depreciating figures. Next up, let us look at the difference. In the AFC, this led to mass conversion of ringgit or other local currency to USD, triggering extreme devaluation of local currency and plunging ASEAN countries into recession. In the GFC, this led to a bank run as depositors withdrew money, leading to the downfall of some of the biggest banks in America. Let us now look at the moral hazard, which was the factor inherent to the demise of both economies, leading them both to an insolvency disaster across the board. The difference, however, was how. In the AFC, crony capitalism based on relationship played the main role in the moral hazard. In the GFC, the undervaluation of risk of toxic securities due to corruption and lack of impartiality of credit agencies led to the demise of the economy. Last but not least, let us look at how both these financial disasters were dealt with. Bailouts. In the AFC, the afflicted countries were bailed out by the IMF with its $40 billion bailout package. In the GFC, the US was bailed out by its government with a stimulus package worth more than $800 billion. The difference lies in the inherent implementation of the bailouts. In the AFC, interest rates were hiked and spending was cut in order to let crony firms go bankrupt, to attract capital back into Asia, and to restore faith in the government's fiscal solvency. These were called contractionary measures. In the GFC, the opposite was evident. Increased government spending, extreme lowering of interest rates and taxes, deleveraging of the system, and bailing out of big firms were witnessed in order to resurrect the economy. These were called expansionary policies.